All right, everyone. It's been a while since I filmed some instructional content here for you all. We've been in the midst of building out this new facility of ours here in Montreal. I wanted to talk about the hands dropping behind the body in transition. So the golfer's hands get stuck too far from the inside, meaning behind us this way, and that usually leads to the club getting stuck too far from the inside. Ton of rotation of the hands and arms to try to prevent blocks from happening. It's a big nightmare situation. I want to get you guys thinking maybe a little differently in how to proceed if you're one of these golfers. So again, just to repeat, we are talking about no matter where you are at the top of the swing, if the hands have this big downward vertical movement in transition, sometimes it's from a pull down, sometimes it's from a poor pivot. We're going to dive into a couple of different scenarios, okay? So the first thing I want you guys to look at if you're somebody who falls into this situation is I want you to look at how the body's moving, because the body is going to play a massive role in where the hands are going to travel throughout the swing, whether they travel around us, upwards, and so on. Okay, so I've talked about this a lot as it relates to the backswing. But if I just lock my arm in place, meaning the relationship between my arm and my chest does not change, and I open up in the backswing this way, well, my hands are going to follow me because that's the direction that all my variables are going, right? So if I just rotate, 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 as I do this, my hands are going to work inwards. The opposite is also true in the downswing. So if I just lock my arm in place, no matter where I am at the top, and my chest rotates here, well, as I rotate, as I rotate, as I rotate, my hands are certainly not dropping behind me. They're moving outward. So if you are somebody who has a big vertical downward force to the hands in transition, or these hands are dropping super far to the inside, one of the first things I want you to look at is the body because of that exact point that I just mentioned. If you see that your body is very slow, what are we going to define as slow? Well, let's say that, we're on our top of our backswing. We have, somewhere around 30, 40 degrees of hip turn, full turn of the upper body, somewhere around 90 degrees where the shoulder gets under the chin. Well, what you'll typically see with golfers whose hands lower a ton in transition down and behind them is that their body gets too slow to where by the time their left arm is parallel to the ground, not only is the obvious part where the hands are like too far behind them, but the lower body will still be very close relative to the target. So you can see here, if I put an alignment stick across my two hips, my two front belt loops, you would see that it's still pointing way to the right for me as a right-handed golfer. That implies that I am slow on the rotation, right? Obviously, the more I rotate, the more square these hips would get sooner, and then obviously more open in the downswing. If you see this big lowering of the hands and you see that my body's not opening up fast enough, well, that could be a massive reason why those hands are dropping to begin with. And what you'll see most commonly afterwards is as you continue coming down, by the time the shaft is parallel to the ground, again, the obvious being that the hands are stuck behind me and the club is stuck behind me, but you would see that maybe these hips just get to square. You would see the chest in a lot of these cases still very close. So now by shaft parallel, a little later into the downswing, if I put a club across my shoulder plane, right, or across my shoulder blades, you would see that that as well is pointing way out to the right. So what's happening is I'm essentially lacking rotation, and rotation is a major element to influence the hand path. And this is all under the understanding that this relationship doesn't change, meaning my left arm and my chest don't move. Now, why am I referring to the left arm and the chest? Well, because this is the second point I want to make. There are a lot of golfers, okay, who actually have the hands dropping in transition, but if you look at their body, they're opening up really good. So then you're going to say, well, if it's not the pivot, meaning like my body is actually opening up quite well, and then I'm opening up quite well, meaning I'm like super rotated, but I'm still very, very stuck. Well, what would be causing me to do that if it's not the rotation of my body? Because that's only one real big issue, but it's not the only reason. Well, then we look at the relationship between the left arm and the chest. We call this abduction and adduction, okay? Now, these are not super important scientific terms for the everyday golfer to know. All you need to know is this left arm getting closer to my body or further from my body? Well, I can manipulate my hand path quite easily by changing the relationship between my arm and my chest, right? So it's not just the rotation of the body that's going to do it. The rotation of my body does it for sure, but it's not the only one. If you are somebody whose left arm, as a right-handed golfer, so we would imply that's the lead arm here, okay? If you're somebody whose lead arm in transition gets closer to the chest by a significant amount, meaning if I was at the top of my swing, Obviously, my left arm here does not look like it's pinned into my chest, but then later into the golf swing, you see that now it's like fully connected. This relationship got a lot closer. Well, that would imply that my hands are going to drop back behind me. Even if my body's rotating, right? It's almost like the very Jim Furyk move. If you ever look at Jim Furyk, he's very, very upright, and then his left arm gets pinned into his chest really aggressively. That's why his trail elbow also looks like it's way behind him. So if you're somebody whose lead arm is getting pinned massively into the chest in the downswing, don't try to work away from that. Like, don't try to manufacture some disconnected outward hand path, because that can feel very uncomfortable to the player, right? You're trying to like throw your hands out in front of your body. It feels super disconnected. It feels like you're way on top of the golf ball. And then it's like, well, how do I find my way back to the golf ball doing that? It just feels too weird. Creates too many bad habits for most of the golfers that have tried that. Okay, and in my experience working with players, it's not really a feeling that they typically like. So there's other ways to work around it. Well, rather than trying to do something crazy with the body, meaning rather than trying to like spin out of your shoes to an extreme amount that's very uncomfortable and you can't really rely on that, there are ways to change it. What I would do is I would get the hands working more up and actually more away from the body, meaning staying in front of you in the backswing, right? If you're somebody who looks like they're in a good spot and then the lead arm like gets pinned back into the chest, even if you're rotating well, you're going to get stuck, right? The hands are going to drop too far behind you. You can't rely on the pivot in that situation. So rather than trying to do something drastic, instead change the lead arms relationship at the top. Meaning rather than starting here, you get the arms much more upright. Now, for the average golfer, that would be a nightmare situation, right? The hands would be way too tall. It would be too hard to shallow the club. And obviously, you would cut across the golf ball. You would get too steep on it. It would be a nightmare. But for the golfers specifically who have the hands dropping too far behind them in transition with this lead arm getting pinned into the chest, and they actually rotate really well, in that situation, a really good way to just offset what they're doing to start their downswing is to just get their starting point at the top more upright. Because now, rather than starting neutral and then this left arm getting stuck into me and my hands getting stuck, even if I rotate really well, I'm stuck here, right? Rather than trying something crazy, we take this backswing and we turn it into this. Now, even if the golfer's lead arm gets closer to the body, their hand path would naturally be a little bit more in front of them in the downswing. They wouldn't get stuck too far from the inside, but you're doing it by just working with their DNA. If their DNA is to reroute the hands and pin the left arm to the chest, what do? You get the hands, instead of being here, you get them a little more upright to offset what their natural DNA is, obviously in transition. And now, even though I'm rotating well, even though my lead arm got closer to my body, the starting point of it was a little more up and out in front of me, I wouldn't be nearly as stuck from the inside, right? And now I'm coming into this golf ball a lot more neutral, and I'm just working with what the player does to start down. So those would be the two most common reasons that we see, either a really poor pivot or a relationship between the lead arm and the chest that changes. Now, there is a third one. I'm going to film a separate video for you guys on this, but it's all about the pull down effect. And there's a lot of you out there who pull down on the club. You see this big downward motion to the hand path. You see the shaft getting really narrow and upright. And then from here, you'll see a lot of golfers kind of stall out to do something to shallow it really late, and it creates problems. We're going to dive into that third point, but it's going to require a nice full-length video on how to go about changing that as well. But those two more common patterns with the pivot problem and the lead arm and chest relationship, those are the ways to start thinking about them, okay?